Hey guys, tonight we begin with what might be the most scandalous chapter in Victorian London's already impressively scandalous history. The hidden world of male prostitution in the supposedly prim and proper 19th century. Spoiler alert, the Victorians were about as prim and proper as a modern-day reality TV show, just with more top hats and considerably worse dental hygiene. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into the gaslit streets where Victorian gentlemen weren't quite as gentle as their reputation suggested. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Victorian England, that everyone was buttoned up, repressed, and spent their evenings quietly reading scripture by candlelight. The popular image shows us stern-faced men in starched collars, discussing the weather while their wives fainted at the mere mention of piano legs. In reality, Victorian London was basically Las Vegas with worse plumbing and more cholera. Think of it like Instagram versus reality. The Victorians were absolute masters of presenting one image to the world while living a completely different truth behind closed doors. This wasn't some idealistic society where everyone followed strict moral codes and retired to bed at 8:30 with a cup of warm milk. It was a messy, complicated, surprisingly modern world where people had the same desires, frustrations, and needs as anyone else. They just had to be more creative about satisfying them. The Victorian era gave us some of the most elaborate systems of public propriety and private indulgence in human history. They essentially invented the concept of what happens in London stays in London, except London was the entire empire. The city's underground world of male prostitution wasn't some tiny, hidden corner of society. It was a thriving, organized industry with its own geography, economy, and surprisingly complex social rules. We're talking about thousands of men making their living this way, from desperate street hustlers to high-end companions who charged more than most people made in a year. And the clients? They weren't just a few scandalous aristocrats sneaking around in the shadows. They were judges, politicians, military officers, clergymen, respectable married men, and basically anyone with enough money and social standing to have something to lose if they got caught. The mid to late 1800s was a time when Britain controlled about a quarter of the world's population and convinced itself it was the moral center of the universe. Victorian London wasn't just any city. It was the capital of the largest empire in human history, home to over 4 million people crammed into a space that should have held maybe half that many. If you thought modern cities had housing problems, imagine London in 1880, a sprawling maze of everything from grand mansions to slums. So horrific they made modern poverty look like a vacation resort. The Church of England controlled much of public morality. Parliament controlled the laws, and Queen Victoria herself supposedly controlled the empire's moral tone. Though let's be honest, she was probably too busy being perpetually in mourning to micromanage everyone's bedroom activities. But here's the thing about control. The tighter you squeeze, the more creative people get about finding ways around the rules. Victorian society created such an elaborate system of public respectability that it basically guaranteed an equally elaborate underground world of private vice. Legal context was crucial here. Male homosexual activity had been illegal since 1533, but the laws were inconsistently enforced and often used more as tools of blackmail and social control than actual justice. The infamous Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which would later be used to prosecute Oscar Wilde, made things technically worse by criminalizing even private consensual acts between men. But ironically, this same period saw the underground world flourish like never before. because prohibition has always been the best marketing strategy vice has ever had. The economic situation made everything more complicated. This was the height of the Industrial Revolution, which created massive wealth for some and grinding poverty for others, often living side by side in the same neighborhoods. Young men flooded into London from all over Britain and Ireland, looking for work that often didn't exist or paid so little they could barely survive. Meanwhile, the growing middle and upper classes had more disposable income than ever before, and Victorian society's strict separation of public and private life meant they needed somewhere to spend it on things they couldn't discuss at dinner. Parties. Class structure was everything in Victorian society, but the underground world created its own parallel hierarchy that often inverted the normal social order. A working-class rent boy could end up with more money and influence than a middle-class clerk, though he'd always be one scandal away from complete ruin. The fascinating thing is how this world developed its own codes, territories, and surprisingly sophisticated networks that connected everyone from street-level operators to some of the most powerful men in the empire. Enter John Saul, whose name alone sounds like it should belong to a respectable Victorian gentleman discussing the weather over tea and crumpets. Instead, John Saul became one of the most notorious male prostitutes in London history, and lucky for us, he was also apparently quite the storyteller. In 1881, Saul published what might be the world's first gay escort memoir, The Sins of the Cities of the Plain, which reads like a Victorian tell-all that would make modern celebrity gossip columnists weep with envy. Saul claimed to have serviced everyone from members of parliament to high-ranking military officers, and his book names names with the enthusiasm of someone who clearly had nothing left to lose. According to his own account, he charged between £1 and £5 per encounter, which doesn't sound like much until he realized that £5 in 1881 had the purchasing power of about $500 today. Not bad for what Saul charmingly referred to as a bit of the old in and out with the gentry. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean completely bonkers, even by Victorian standards. Saul didn't just write about individual encounters. He described an entire underground network of male brothels, private clubs, and what he called accommodation houses scattered throughout central London. He wrote about places like the famous Cleveland Street, which would later become the center of one of the biggest political scandals of the Victorian era, and described a world where young men from working-class backgrounds could earn more in a week than their fathers made in a month. The fascinating contradiction here is that Saul presents himself as both victim and entrepreneur, sometimes describing his work as desperate survival and other times as a conscious business decision. He talks about learning the trade from other, more experienced prostitutes who taught him everything from how to dress to attract certain types of clients to how to avoid the police raids that periodically swept through known gathering spots. This wasn't just random street hustling. It was an organized industry with its own training programs. For crying out loud, what makes Saul's account particularly valuable is that he describes the clients as much as the providers. According to him, the typical customer was a married man from the upper or middle classes who maintained a completely respectable public life, while secretly frequenting what Saul called the houses. These weren't desperate, obviously gay men living on society's margins. They were pillars of the community, who had learned to compartmentalize their lives with remarkable skill. Saul also reveals the economic reality behind the romantic myths. This wasn't some world of passionate love affairs between men defying society's rules. It was primarily a business transaction between people with money and people who needed money. The emotional connections, when they happened, were almost incidental to the basic economic exchange. Some clients became regulars who developed genuine relationships with particular prostitutes. But the foundation was always financial. The modern parallel would be like finding out that your most straight-laced, conservative politician had a secret OnlyFans account and was documenting every interaction for posterity. Saul's memoir gives us a window into a world that was supposed to be invisible, described by someone who had absolutely no reason to lie about it since he'd already destroyed his reputation by publishing it in the first place. And if you think John Saul's story is wild, wait until you hear about the Cleveland Street scandal, where this underground world crashed headfirst into the highest levels of British society. This wasn't just about sex or money, or even individual survival, though. It was definitely about all of those things. The Victorian male prostitution scene existed at the intersection of some of the most powerful forces shaping 19th century Britain: class warfare, religious hypocrisy, imperial politics, and the fundamental tension between public morality and private reality. For the prostitutes themselves, the stakes were immediate and brutal. Getting caught could mean prison, public humiliation, and complete social exile. The 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act carried sentences of up to 2 years of hard labor, and Victorian prisons were not known for their rehabilitation programs or concern for human rights. We're talking about places where you could die from the conditions before you finished your sentence. But for many young men, particularly those from Ireland or the rural areas of England and Scotland, the choice was between potentially deadly risks and certain starvation. For the clients, the stakes were arguably even higher because they had more to lose. A working-class rent boy caught in a raid might end up in prison, but a member of parliament or military officer caught in the same raid could lose everything: career, family, social position, and any hope of future respectability. Victorian society was remarkably good at forgiveness, but only for certain types of sins. Financial corruption could be overlooked. Political incompetence could be forgotten. But sexual scandal involving other men was basically a social death sentence. Broader implications rippled through British society in ways that are still visible today. The same moral panic that drove the male prostitution trade underground also shaped British attitudes towards sexuality, gender roles, and social conformity for generations. The elaborate systems of secrecy and coded language that developed around this world influenced everything from literature to politics to the way British people learned to separate their public and private selves. At the imperial level, Britain was busy lecturing the rest of the world about moral superiority while simultaneously running one of the most sophisticated underground vice economies in human history. The hypocrisy wasn't lost on contemporary observers, and it certainly wasn't lost on the colonies, who were being told to adopt British moral standards while British elites were privately ignoring those same standards on an industrial scale. This was also about power, who had it, who wanted it, and how sexual secrets could be used to gain or maintain it. The potential for blackmail was enormous, and there's evidence that information about clients' activities was sometimes used for political purposes. But John Saul and his memoir were just the tip of what turned out to be a very large, very well-organized iceberg. While Saul was busy documenting his adventures for posterity, the industry he described was evolving into something far more sophisticated than simple street-level prostitution. By the 1880s, Victorian London had developed what can only be described as a parallel economy of male companionship, complete with specialized venues, professional networks, and pricing structures that would make modern business consultants proud. The world Saul described wasn't static. It was constantly adapting to social pressures, legal changes, and economic opportunities. New venues opened and closed. New neighborhoods became fashionable or dangerous, and new methods of connecting clients with providers emerged with the regularity of seasonal fashion changes. What started as desperate survival strategies for some of London's most vulnerable young men had evolved into a surprisingly sophisticated service industry. Meanwhile, the clients were also evolving. The men Saul serviced in the 1870s and early 1880s were pioneers in their own way, figuring out how to navigate between their public lives and private desires. But by the mid-1880s, a new generation of clients had emerged. Men who had grown up knowing this world existed and who approached it with less guilt and more businesslike efficiency. And all of this was happening just as British society was about to be rocked by a scandal that would expose the connections between this underground world and the highest levels of government and society. The Cleveland Street affair was coming, and it would change everything. The geography of Victorian male prostitution wasn't random. It was as carefully planned as any other business district in London, just with considerably more secrecy and significantly better interior decorating. Unlike the common assumption that this was just desperate men hanging around dark alleyways hoping for the best, the reality was a sophisticated network of specialized venues, each serving different markets with the precision of a modern retail chain. Think Amazon, but for illegal Victorian sex work and with much better customer service. This geographic organization developed because Victorian society's strict separation between public respectability and private vice created specific spatial needs. Clients needed places that were discreet but accessible, upscale but deniable, and convenient but not too convenient. You couldn't have a male brothel right next to your gentleman's club, because that would be awkward at the annual Christmas party. The result was a carefully mapped underground world that existed in the spaces between respectable Victorian London. The industry clustered around three main areas: the West End theatres and entertainment district, certain residential neighbourhoods in central London, and surprisingly, some of the more respectable areas where clients lived or worked. This wasn't confined to London's notorious slums. Some of the most successful operations were in neighborhoods where you'd expect to find respectable middle-class families discussing the latest Charles Dickens novel over dinner. What made this system work was its integration with legitimate businesses and social spaces. Male prostitutes didn't just loiter on street corners waiting for customers to approach. They developed sophisticated methods of advertising their services, connecting with clients, and conducting business that would make modern marketing professionals weep with admiration. They used theater programs, gentlemen's clubs, public baths, and even certain churches as networking opportunities. Yes, churches, because apparently Victorian men could find a way to turn literally any social gathering into a business opportunity. The whole system operated on what we might now call a hub and spoke model, with central locations serving as coordination points for a network of individual operators and smaller venues. But this wasn't controlled by some Victorian crime boss sitting in a smoke-filled room. It was more like a professional association, with established practitioners helping newcomers learn the trade and experienced operators sharing information about everything from which clients paid well to which neighborhoods were currently being watched by the police. Take Cleveland Street, which became the most famous address in Victorian scandal history, though not for reasons its respectable residents initially appreciated. Number 19 Cleveland Street looked like any other modest townhouse in the Fitzrovia neighborhood. 3 stories, unremarkable brick facade, the kind of place where you'd expect to find a clerk's family living quietly and paying their rent on time. Instead, it housed what was essentially the Harrods of male prostitution, a full-service establishment that catered to clients with very specific and very expensive tastes. The house was run by Charles Hammond, who had apparently missed his calling as a hotel manager because he ran the place with remarkable efficiency. Hammond maintained what could only be described as a roster of young men, each specializing in different types of clients and services. Some were theater performers who worked part-time. Others were telegraph boys who had discovered that their regular jobs provided excellent cover for more lucrative evening activities. The telegraph boys were particularly clever. They already had legitimate reasons to be traveling around London at all hours, carrying messages that could easily be reinterpreted as something other than official communications. One former telegraph boy, Henry Newlove, later testified that he earned more in a week at Cleveland Street than he made in 3 months at his regular job. The math was compelling. Telegraph boys earned about 12 shillings a week, while a single encounter at Cleveland Street could pay a sovereign 20 shillings. It's like discovering that your weekend Uber driving could pay more than your full-time office job, except with considerably more legal risk and Victorian-era sexually transmitted diseases. Hammond's operation was sophisticated enough to have what we'd now call customer relationship management. Regular clients had preferences that were carefully noted and accommodated. Some wanted the fantasy of corrupting innocent young working men. Others preferred more experienced partners who knew what they were doing. Some clients wanted conversation and companionship along with physical services. Others wanted pure efficiency. Hammond essentially ran a concierge service for illegal sex, and by all accounts, customer satisfaction was remarkably high. The house maintained careful operational security that would impress modern intelligence agencies. Clients entered through different entrances depending on their social status. Peers and politicians used the front door, while middle-class professionals used a side entrance. New clients required introductions from existing customers, and Hammond kept detailed records of who visited when, though he had the sense to use code names rather than real identities. The place operated like a private club with membership requirements, dress codes, and social protocols. Another successful operation ran out of what appeared to be a respectable boarding house near Russell Square. The landlady, Mrs. Phillips, advertised rooms for young professional gentlemen in perfectly legitimate newspapers, but her selection criteria focused less on professional qualifications and more on physical attributes and willingness to provide extra services to certain types of boarders. The genius of this setup was that it provided perfect cover. Young men living there had legitimate reasons to be meeting with older, wealthier men who could plausibly be described as mentors or business contacts. Mrs. Phillips charged her special. Boarders reduced rent in exchange for availability, and she took a percentage of their earnings from client meetings. She also provided coaching on everything from proper dress to conversation skills, essentially running a finishing school for male prostitutes. Some of her former boarders went on to successful careers, not in prostitution, but in legitimate businesses, having learned networking and social skills that served them well in conventional professional settings. The most elaborate operation may have been the network of private clubs that masqueraded as athletic or social organizations. The 100 Guineas Club supposedly existed to promote physical fitness among young men, but their exercise regimens focused on activities that wouldn't typically be found in modern gym programs. Members paid substantial fees for access to facilities that included private rooms, elaborate bathing areas, and what club literature euphemistically described as specialized training sessions with experienced instructors. These clubs provided the ultimate in discretion because membership itself was a mark of respectability. Clients could tell their wives they were attending their athletic club, which was technically true, even if the athletics involved weren't the kind typically discussed at dinner parties. The clubs maintained waiting lists, conducted membership interviews, and even published newsletters, though the content required careful reading between the lines to understand what services were actually being offered. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing in Victorian society ever was. The same moral framework that drove this industry underground also created genuine complications that affected everyone involved, from the prostitutes to the clients to the entrepreneurs who organized it all. The central contradiction was that Victorian society simultaneously created the conditions that made male prostitution economically attractive, while making it legally and socially catastrophic if you got caught. For the young men involved, the financial incentives were enormous, but so were the psychological costs. Many came from backgrounds where homosexual activity was not just illegal, but genuinely unthinkable. Rural Irish Catholics, Scottish Presbyterians, English Methodists, who had been raised to believe that what they were doing was literally damnable. The money was life-changing, but the guilt was often psychologically devastating. Some managed to compartmentalize successfully, treating it as temporary work to survive economic hardship. Others suffered what we now recognize as serious mental health consequences. The clients faced their own contradictions. Many were married men who genuinely loved their wives and children, but had sexual needs that couldn't be met within the confines of Victorian marriage. Others were men who might have lived openly homosexual lives if they'd been born in different times or places, but who had to maintain elaborate facades to preserve their careers and social positions. Some clients developed genuine emotional relationships with particular prostitutes, creating complicated situations where financial transactions became entangled with real affection. The entrepreneurs running these operations faced the most complex contradictions of all. They were providing services that clearly met market demand. The waiting lists and repeat customers proved that. They were also creating economic opportunities for young men who might otherwise have starved or turned to more dangerous forms of crime. But they were also participating in a system that could destroy the lives of everyone involved if it was exposed. Law enforcement created its own contradictions. Police knew these operations existed and generally knew where to find them. But raids were inconsistent and often seemed more motivated by political considerations than genuine law enforcement. Some police officers were reportedly clients themselves, creating obvious conflicts of interest. Others were paid to provide advance warning of raids, turning law enforcement into another layer of the business rather than a genuine threat to it. The medical establishment added another layer of complexity. Victorian physicians were beginning to understand sexually transmitted diseases, but had no effective treatments for most of them. They knew that prostitution, male and female, was a public health issue, but they couldn't discuss it openly without acknowledging that it existed. Some doctors quietly treated clients and prostitutes, maintaining professional discretion while contributing to the system's invisibility. Even the religious community was divided. Official church doctrine condemned homosexual activity in the strongest possible terms, but individual clergy members sometimes found themselves in the position of providing pastoral care to people involved in the trade, either as clients struggling with guilt or as prostitutes trying to leave the life. Some priests and ministers developed surprisingly nuanced understandings of the economic and social forces that drove young men into prostitution, even while maintaining that the activity itself was sinful. The result was a system that was simultaneously incredibly successful and incredibly fragile. By the 1880s, Victorian London's male prostitution industry was generating what economists would now call significant economic activity. Thousands of pounds changing hands annually, supporting not just the prostitutes and their clients, but landlords, servants, clothiers, and various other service providers who may not have fully understood what they were supporting but were happy to accept the money. The wealth generated by this underground economy had real effects on London's social structure. Young men who might have remained in grinding poverty were able to afford better housing, clothing, and education. Some used their earnings to start legitimate businesses or pay for professional training. Others sent money back to families in Ireland or rural England, becoming the primary economic support for parents and siblings who had no idea where the money was coming from. The clients, meanwhile, were often spending substantial portions of their discretionary income on these services. A member of Parliament dropping £5 for an evening's entertainment was redirecting money that might otherwise have been spent on legitimate businesses, charitable causes, or family expenses. The economic impact rippled through London's economy in ways that would have horrified respectable Victorian economists if they'd been able to track it. Institutional reactions varied wildly depending on who was reacting and what they knew. The Metropolitan Police developed an unofficial policy of selective enforcement that focused on protecting the most politically sensitive clients while occasionally conducting raids that looked like serious law enforcement efforts. Police Commissioner Edmund Henderson later admitted that his department had received guidance about which establishments should be left alone and which could be targeted if political pressure required visible action. The legal system proved remarkably flexible when it came to processing cases that did make it to court. Judges and prosecutors, many of whom moved in the same social circles as the clients, developed creative interpretations of evidence that often allowed cases to be dismissed on technical grounds. When convictions were unavoidable, sentences were often surprisingly light, particularly for defendants who could afford competent legal representation. The press created its own complications through their coverage, or more accurately, their careful lack of coverage. Newspapers knew about the major operations, but faced a difficult balance between their commercial interests in scandalous stories and their dependence on advertisers and readers who might be implicated. The result was a peculiar form of journalism that reported on moral degradation in general terms while carefully avoiding specific details that might identify actual participants. Social reformers found themselves in impossible positions. Many genuinely wanted to address the economic conditions that drove young men into prostitution, but they couldn't discuss those conditions publicly without acknowledging that the prostitution existed. Others focused on general moral improvement, campaigns that addressed symptoms rather than causes, leading to reform efforts that were often ineffective because they couldn't directly address the problems they were trying to solve. The most significant long-term consequence was the development of increasingly sophisticated systems of secrecy and coded communication that would influence British sexual culture for generations. Meanwhile, as Hammond's Cleveland Street operation was perfecting the art of discreet full-service male prostitution, and Mrs. Phillips was running her finishing school for aspiring rent boys, a completely different aspect of the trade was developing in the shadows of London's legitimate entertainment industry. If the residential brothels represented the established, organized side of the business, the theater and music hall scene represented its more chaotic, creative, and ultimately more dangerous cousin. The West End wasn't just London's entertainment district. It was becoming a massive, complex ecosystem where the line between performance and prostitution was often deliberately blurred. Young men who came to London dreaming of careers on the stage quickly discovered that their most marketable skills might have nothing to do with their ability to remember lines or carry a tune. Theater programs became informal directories of available companionship. Backstage areas became negotiation spaces, and the distinction between actors and sex workers became increasingly meaningless. This theatrical world operated by completely different rules than the residential brothels. Where Cleveland Street offered discretion and reliability, the theater scene offered excitement, youth, and the intoxicating possibility of genuine glamour. Clients weren't just purchasing sexual services. They were buying access to a world of creativity and rebellion that their respectable daily lives couldn't provide. And the young men weren't just earning money. They were learning skills, making connections, and sometimes actually launching legitimate careers in entertainment. But this intersection of commerce and creativity was about to produce some of the most spectacular scandals in Victorian history. involving everyone from minor music hall performers to Oscar Wilde himself. If the residential brothels and private clubs were the Wall Street of Victorian male prostitution, organized, professional, and focused on reliable returns, then Theater District was its Hollywood. Chaotic, glamorous, full of beautiful young dreamers, and absolutely crawling with predators disguised as talent scouts. The West End entertainment scene didn't just tolerate the intersection of performance and prostitution. It actively cultivated it with the enthusiasm of a Victorian entrepreneur who discovered a new way to monetize human desperation. Unlike the discreet, almost corporate operations we've discussed, the theatrical world operated on completely different principles: visibility, personality, and the intoxicating promise that tonight's rent boy could become tomorrow's leading man. This wasn't about anonymous transactions and carefully managed private spaces. This was about young men using their bodies, their charm, and their ambitions as currencies in a marketplace where the difference between actor and prostitute was often just a matter of which stage you happened to be performing on. The theater district became important because it solved several problems that the residential operations couldn't address. First, it provided perfect cover. Young men have legitimate reasons to be hanging around theaters, talking to older wealthy men who might plausibly be producers, directors, or patrons of the arts. Second, it offered the possibility of genuine career advancement alongside the immediate financial benefits. And third, it attracted a completely different type of client. Men who weren't just looking for sexual services, but who wanted the fantasy of discovering and corrupting fresh talent. This world developed its own ecosystem that was part legitimate entertainment industry, part informal employment agency, and part elaborate sexual marketplace. Theater programs became coded directories, backstage areas became negotiation spaces, and opening nights became networking events, where the networking had very little to do with advancing anyone's legitimate theatrical career. The most successful participants learned to navigate multiple roles simultaneously: performer, prostitute, social climber, and sometimes genuine artist, often within the space of a single evening. What made this system particularly complex was that it wasn't entirely illegitimate. Some young men did launch real careers through connections made in this world. Some of the older men were genuinely interested in supporting artistic talent, even if their support came with certain expectations. And some of the relationships that began as purely transactional evolved into genuine mentorship or even love affairs that lasted for years. The problem was that nobody could ever be entirely sure which category they were operating in, which made every interaction a high-stakes gamble where the wrong bet could destroy your reputation, your career, or your life. Consider the career of Alfred Taylor, who became one of the most notorious figures in this theatrical underworld and would eventually play a crucial role in Oscar Wilde's downfall. Taylor wasn't technically an actor, but he moved through the theater world with the confidence of someone who belonged there, cultivating relationships with young performers and older patrons with equal skill. His rooms in Little College Street became a sort of informal salon where aspiring actors could meet potential benefactors, though the exact nature of the benefits being offered was left diplomatically unclear. Taylor's operation was brilliant in its simplicity. He threw parties that were technically just social gatherings for people interested in the arts. Young men from the theater world would attend, along with older gentlemen who described themselves as patrons or critics. The parties featured good food, excellent wine, intellectual conversation about literature and drama, and opportunities for private discussions that might lead to various forms of financial support for struggling artists. Taylor never explicitly organized prostitution. He just created environments where it could happen organically while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved. One of Taylor's most successful protégés was Charles Parker, a former Valet who discovered he had remarkable theatrical talents, though not necessarily the kind that involved memorizing Shakespeare. Parker learned to present himself as an aspiring actor who was unfortunately between roles and might be persuaded to accept financial assistance from generous patrons who appreciated his potential. He developed an elaborate backstory involving Provincial, theater experience, and letters of recommendation from imaginary directors, and he was apparently convincing enough that some clients genuinely believed they were supporting the next great English actor rather than paying for sex. Parker's success illustrates how the theatrical cover story worked for both sides of the transaction. Clients could tell themselves, and their wives, if necessary, that they were supporting the arts rather than engaging prostitutes. The young men could maintain their dignity by framing their activities as temporary necessity on the path to legitimate careers. And entrepreneurs like Taylor could position themselves as cultural facilitators rather than pimps. Everyone got to maintain the fiction that this was about art and mentorship rather than simple commercial sex work. The music halls presented a different but equally complex dynamic. Unlike the legitimate theaters, music halls were already considered somewhat disreputable, which paradoxically made them safer spaces for these kinds of arrangements. Performers like Harry Atherton made no secret of their availability for private entertainment after shows, advertising their services through suggestive songs and obvious flirtation with audience members. Music hall programs often included subtle advertisements for private lessons or personal consultations that regular audience members learned to decode. Atherton's career illustrates the economic possibilities this world offered. He started as a barely paid chorus performer, but discovered that his real talents lay in private performance. Within 2 years, he was earning enough to maintain his own apartment, dress fashionably, and support his elderly mother back in Manchester. He also developed a regular clientele that included several members of Parliament, 2 bishops, and at least 1 member of the royal household staff. His success came from understanding that he wasn't just selling sex. He was selling the fantasy of intimate access to the glamorous world of entertainment. The most elaborate operation may have been the network surrounding the notorious Pose Plastique performances that became popular in certain private clubs. These were supposedly artistic presentations where young men recreated famous classical sculptures or paintings, wearing minimal clothing and holding dramatic poses. In practice, they were essentially strip shows with classical pretensions, but the artistic framework provided legal and social cover that pure nudity wouldn't have offered. The performers in these shows, led by entrepreneurs like James Burton, developed increasingly sophisticated presentations that blurred every possible line between art and pornography. Burton's troupe included former art students, aspiring actors, and genuine artists who had discovered that their classical education could be remarkably profitable when applied to private entertainment. Clients paid substantial fees to attend these artistic salons, and additional fees for private consultations, where individual performers could provide more detailed instruction in classical aesthetics. What made Burton's operation particularly successful was that it attracted clients who might never have considered visiting a traditional brothel, but could justify attending artistic presentations. University professors, museum curators, and cultural critics became regular attendees, convinced themselves that they were supporting important cultural work rather than indulging in elaborate sexual fantasy. Some clients genuinely were interested in the artistic aspects, creating complicated situations where aesthetic, appreciation, and sexual desire became impossible to separate. The downside of this visibility was that the theatrical world was much more vulnerable to scandal than the discreet residential operations. When things went wrong, and they frequently did, the consequences were very public and very dramatic, involving not just the participants, but the entire entertainment industry that had provided cover for these activities. This wasn't isolated to London's theatre district. Similar patterns emerged wherever entertainment and commerce intersected in Victorian Britain. Provincial theatre companies, touring the countryside, developed their own versions of these arrangements, often with local wealthy patrons providing support for promising young performers. Music halls in Manchester, Birmingham, and Edinburgh all developed their own informal networks, connecting entertainers with patrons, whose interests extended beyond appreciation for the performing arts. The pattern that emerged was remarkably consistent. Legitimate entertainment venues provided perfect cover for sexual commerce, because the basic transactions, older wealthy men providing financial support to younger attractive performers, looked identical whether the support was genuinely artistic or primarily sexual. The ambiguity was often deliberately maintained because it served everyone's interests to keep the true nature of relationships unclear. This pattern existed because Victorian society had created a specific set of social and economic conditions that made it almost inevitable. The entertainment industry was legitimate but precarious. Performers lived constantly on the edge of financial disaster, dependent on the approval and financial support of wealthier patrons. At the same time, Victorian moral codes made it impossible for many men to pursue their sexual interests openly, creating demand for relationships that could be disguised as something else. The economic structure was crucial. Unlike other industries where workers had predictable wages, performers' incomes were completely unpredictable. A successful run could provide months of financial security, but most shows failed quickly, leaving performers desperate for alternative income sources. This economic instability created a pool of available young men who had the social skills, physical attractiveness, and social connections that made them ideal for sex work, but who could frame their activities as temporary expedients rather than career choices. The social structure of the entertainment world also facilitated these arrangements. Theatre people were already outside conventional Victorian social categories. They were respectable enough to mix with the middle and upper classes, but unconventional enough that unusual relationships and living arrangements didn't attract the same scrutiny they would have in other contexts. An actor living with an older male patron was unremarkable in ways that would have been scandalous for a clerk or a shopkeeper. Legal enforcement was also inconsistent in the entertainment district because authorities recognized that too much scrutiny would damage London's reputation as a cultural center. Police raids on theaters were rare and usually politically motivated rather than driven by genuine law enforcement concerns. This created a relatively safe environment for activities that would have been much riskier in residential neighborhoods. The international nature of the entertainment industry added another layer of complexity. Touring companies brought performers from across Europe and America, creating opportunities for exotic services that weren't available through local providers. Foreign performers also faced fewer social consequences if their activities were exposed, since they could simply leave London and continue their careers elsewhere. The effects were far-reaching and often unexpected. The entertainment industry's tolerance for ambiguous relationships between performers and patrons gradually normalized similar arrangements in other sectors of Victorian society. Art schools, for example, developed their own versions of patron-student relationships that sometimes included sexual elements. Private clubs focused on literature or philosophy created opportunities for older members to mentor younger men in ways that extended beyond intellectual guidance. The winners in this system were obviously the successful performers who managed to balance legitimate careers with profitable patron relationships. Some used their entertainment industry connections to launch businesses, enter politics, or gain access to social circles that would have been impossible to reach through conventional means. Alfred Taylor, despite his eventual involvement in the wild scandal, maintained his social connections and financial security for years through his careful cultivation of theatrical and aristocratic contacts. The entertainment industry itself benefited financially from these arrangements, even when theater owners and managers maintained plausible deniability about what was happening in their venues. Patrons who were paying for private access to performers were also typically generous supporters of the theaters themselves, funding productions and providing financial stability that allowed the industry to take artistic risks it couldn't otherwise afford. But there were significant losers as well. Young performers who became too closely associated with patron relationships often found it impossible to establish legitimate careers, since their reputations made them unsuitable for respectable productions. The entertainment industry's reputation suffered, making it more difficult for genuinely talented performers to gain acceptance in polite society. The broader cultural impact was enormous. This world produced or influenced many of the most important artists and writers of the Victorian era, including Oscar Wilde, whose relationships with young men from the theater world would eventually destroy his career and reputation. The aesthetic and literary movements that emerged from these circles, particularly the emphasis on beauty, youth, and rebellion against conventional morality, shaped British culture in ways that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Unintended consequences included the development of increasingly sophisticated blackmail operations targeting both performers and patrons. Information about patron relationships became valuable currency that could be used for political or financial advantage. Some entrepreneurs shifted from organizing entertainment to organizing blackmail schemes, using their knowledge of client preferences and performer availability to extract money through threats of exposure. The most significant long-term impact was the creation of a model for how sexual minorities could create alternative social and economic networks within officially hostile societies. The techniques developed in Victorian London's entertainment district, using legitimate institutions as cover, creating coded communication systems, building networks based on mutual economic interest rather than purely personal relationships, would be adapted and refined by subsequent generations, facing similar legal and social challenges. Yet, even as the entertainment world was perfecting its elaborate dance of performance and prostitution, creating fortunes for some and destroying reputations for others, the entire system was becoming increasingly unstable. The very visibility that made the theater district so attractive to clients and performers also made it vulnerable to the kind of spectacular public exposure that could bring down not just individual participants, but the entire network of relationships that made it possible. By the late 1880s, several factors were converging to create what we might now call a perfect storm. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 had made prosecution easier and penalties more severe. A new generation of moral reformers was specifically targeting the entertainment industry as a source of social corruption. Political tensions were creating demand for scapegoats who could be sacrificed to demonstrate government commitment to public morality. And most dangerously, some participants were becoming careless about maintaining the elaborate facades that had protected everyone involved. The careful balance between public respectability and private vice that had allowed this world to flourish was about to collapse in the most dramatic way possible. The Cleveland Street scandal was approaching, and when it broke, it would expose connections between the underground world of male prostitution and the highest levels of British society, including members of the royal family. The entertainment industry's comfortable ambiguities were about to be replaced by very uncomfortable clarities, and the consequences would reshape both the sex trade and British society itself. By the summer of 1889, the carefully constructed world of Victorian male prostitution was about to experience what modern crisis management experts would recognize as a complete systemic failure. the kind where every possible safeguard breaks down simultaneously, and everything that could go wrong does go wrong, usually in the most public and embarrassing way imaginable. The Cleveland Street affair wasn't just a scandal. It was a masterclass in how a well-organized underground economy could collapse spectacularly when arrogance, carelessness, and bad luck converged at exactly the wrong moment. The situation had reached a breaking point because several independent factors were creating unprecedented pressure on the entire system. The Metropolitan Police had a new commander who actually wanted to enforce laws rather than just manage them diplomatically. A handful of moral reform organizations had finally figured out how to coordinate their efforts effectively. Most dangerously, some of the key players in the underground world had become so successful and confident that they'd started taking risks that would have horrified their more cautious predecessors. At the center of the brewing storm was 19 Cleveland Street, Charles Hammond's establishment that had been operating so successfully for years that Hammond apparently believed he was untouchable. The house had developed a client list that read like a directory of British power and influence, members of parliament, military officers, church officials, and most explosively, connections that reached directly into the royal household. These weren't just any clients. These were men whose exposure would potentially destabilize the government and embarrass the monarchy at a time when both institutions were already facing significant political challenges. The stakes involved were enormous, on every level. For the young men working at Cleveland Street, exposure meant prison, social exile, and quite possibly physical violence from outraged family members or communities. For the clients, the consequences were potentially career-ending and socially catastrophic, but for some of them, the implications went far beyond personal ruin. If certain names became public, the scandal could damage Britain's international reputation, complicate diplomatic relationships, and potentially trigger a constitutional crisis. What made this situation particularly volatile was that everyone involved knew how high the stakes were, but nobody was quite sure who else knew what. Hammond knew he had powerful clients, but he didn't fully understand the extent of their political connections. The clients knew their activities were illegal, but they didn't realize how much evidence was accumulating against them. The police knew they were investigating something significant, but they didn't initially understand that they were about to stumble into the most politically sensitive case in Victorian history. And the government officials, who would soon be managing the crisis, had no idea that their own attempts at damage control would actually make the situation exponentially worse. The beginning of the end started with the most mundane possible catalyst. A teenage telegraph boy named Charles Swinscow getting caught stealing money from the General Post Office. On July 4, 1889, postal investigators discovered that Swinscow had been supplementing his 12-shilling weekly wages by helping himself to postal money orders. During interrogation, faced with prosecution and probable imprisonment, Swinscow made a desperate decision that would ultimately bring down one of London's most exclusive male brothels and nearly topple the government. "I can tell you how I really get my money," Swinscow reportedly told his interrogators, probably not realizing that this confession would launch the most sensational scandal of the Victorian era. He described how he and several other telegraph boys had been earning substantial additional income by visiting a house on Cleveland Street, where they provided sexual services to wealthy gentlemen who paid far more generously than the postal service. What started as a routine investigation into petty theft suddenly became something much more serious when Swinscow started naming names, both of his fellow telegraph boys and, more explosively, of some of their clients. The postal investigators, probably wishing they'd never asked, found themselves in possession of information that was far beyond their pay grade or expertise. They passed the case to the Metropolitan Police, specifically to Inspector Frederick Aberline. Yes, The same Aberline who was simultaneously investigating the Jack the Ripper murders. Because apparently 1889 was just that kind of year for London law enforcement. Aberline quickly realized that this wasn't going to be a simple prostitution case when his investigation started turning up connections to some of the most prominent names in British society. On August 29, 1889, police raided 19 Cleveland Street. But they found the bird had flown. Charles Hammond had received advance warning and disappeared, taking most of his records and several of his employees with him. The raid was simultaneously too little and too much. Too little because the main targets had escaped, but too much because the very fact that it had happened sent panic through London's entire underground network. Within days, telegraph boys were disappearing from their jobs. Clients were burning correspondence, and everyone connected to the scene was either fleeing the country or desperately trying to establish alibis for activities that had previously required no justification. The investigation might have been quietly buried at this point. After all, the main evidence had vanished and the key witnesses had scattered. But Aberline had developed an inconvenient dedication to actually solving the case. He tracked down several of the telegraph boys who had fled London, and under questioning, they provided detailed accounts of their activities at Cleveland Street. More importantly, they started naming clients, and the names they provided made senior police officials wished they'd never heard of Cleveland Street. The list included Lord Arthur Somerset, equerry to the Prince of Wales and son of the Duke of Beaufort. It included Colonel Jervois, who commanded a regiment of the Scots Guards. Most explosively, the telegraph boys claimed that Prince Albert Victor, Prince Eddie, grandson of Queen Victoria and second in line to the throne, had been a regular visitor to Cleveland Street. Whether this last claim was true or not, the mere fact that it was being made by apparently credible witnesses created a crisis that reached the highest levels of government. By September 1889, the case had escalated far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. Prime Minister Lord Salisbury was personally involved in managing the investigation. The Prince of Wales was demanding updates on anything that might affect his son. The Attorney General was reviewing every piece of evidence to determine what could safely be made public. And Hammond, who had fled to France, was apparently threatening to publish detailed accounts of his client list unless he received financial guarantees for his continued silence. The government's response was a masterclass in how not to handle a crisis. Instead of conducting a thorough investigation and letting the chips fall where they may, or alternatively, deciding to bury the entire matter quietly, officials chose a middle course that satisfied no one and ultimately made everything worse. They allowed some prosecutions to proceed, targeting the telegraph boys and other working-class participants while apparently protecting the wealthy clients through a combination of legal maneuvering and diplomatic pressure. Lord Arthur Somerset was allowed to flee the country before he could be arrested, supposedly on a hunting trip to Austria that became permanent exile. Prince Albert Victor was provided with an elaborate alibi involving official duties that supposedly proved he couldn't have been at Cleveland Street during the relevant times, though the alibi was so obviously constructed after the fact that it convinced few people who examined it closely. Other clients simply disappeared from the investigation without explanation, their names removed from witness statements and their involvement denied by officials who had previously acknowledged it. The most dramatic moment came in November 1889, when the radical newspaper North London Press, edited by Ernest Park, published an article directly accusing Lord Arthur Somerset of systematic corruption of telegraph boys, and suggesting that powerful individuals were being protected while working-class participants faced prosecution. The article stopped just short of naming Prince Albert Victor directly, but it included enough coded language that any informed reader could understand what was being suggested. For the first time, the scandal had moved from private government crisis to public controversy, and the government's handling of the case was being openly questioned in the press. These weren't isolated incidents happening in separate corners of London. They were all part of an interconnected web of relationships, financial arrangements, and information networks that linked virtually everyone involved in London's underground sexual economy. The connections were so extensive that investigating any one case inevitably led to discoveries about dozens of others, creating a cascading effect that police and government officials found increasingly difficult to control. George Veck's photographic business, for example, wasn't just connected to Cleveland Street through shared clientele. He actually provided services to Hammond's operation, taking promotional photographs that were used to advertise particular young men to potential clients. These weren't crude pornographic images, but sophisticated portraits that emphasized youth, innocence, and availability in ways that informed viewers could decode while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved. Veck essentially invented the concept of escort advertising, creating images that sold fantasy and desire without explicitly depicting sexual activity. The financial networks were particularly complex because they had to operate within the constraints of Victorian banking systems while serving clients who needed absolute discretion. Money moved through a series of intermediaries, false names, and indirect transactions that would have impressed modern money launderers. Hammond, for instance, didn't just collect fees directly from clients. He operated through a network of agents, intermediaries, and front businesses that made it nearly impossible to trace financial connections between specific clients and specific services. One of the most surprising discoveries was that several of London's most respectable gentlemen's clubs were unknowingly serving as informal coordination centers for this underground economy. Clients would meet at their clubs to exchange information about services, providers, and opportunities, using the kind of coded language that club members were accustomed to using for discussing other discrete matters like gambling debts or extramarital affairs. The clubs provided perfect cover because members regularly discussed business and social connections that required discretion. So conversations about interesting young men or private entertainment didn't attract attention from staff or other members. The information networks were sophisticated enough to include early warning systems about police activity, government investigations, and social gossip that might threaten participants. News about raids, arrests, or investigations spread through this community faster than through official channels, allowing people to take protective action before authorities could act. During the Cleveland Street investigation, for example, several potential witnesses disappeared from London days before police attempted to interview them, suggesting that they had received advance warning from sources within law enforcement. Political connections created the most complex web of all, because many clients were men who had significant influence over the very laws and institutions that were supposed to be prosecuting them. Members of Parliament who frequented male brothels were often involved in drafting legislation about sexual offenses. Military officers who purchased sexual services from young men were responsible for enforcing discipline and moral standards within their commands. Church officials who engaged prostitutes were simultaneously preaching about moral purity and sexual restraint. These contradictions created opportunities for mutual protection and mutual destruction that influenced political decision-making in ways that are probably still not fully understood. The international connections were equally important because the British Empire's global reach meant that individuals involved in London's sexual underground often had business, military, or colonial connections that extended across continents. When scandals threatened to break, participants could disappear into colonial administrations, military postings, or business opportunities in India, Australia, or other imperial territories where their backgrounds would be less likely to attract scrutiny. The empire essentially provided a global witness protection program for people fleeing sexual scandals. Perhaps most fascinatingly, the social reform movements that were supposedly fighting against sexual vice were sometimes connected to the same networks they were trying to expose. Some reformers had personal knowledge of the underground world that informed their campaigns, but also compromised their ability to speak openly about what they knew. Others were former participants who had found religious conversion or moral awakening, bringing sight or knowledge to their reform efforts, but also creating vulnerabilities to blackmail or exposure. The result was a reform movement that was often remarkably well-informed about the realities of sexual commerce, but constrained in how directly it could address those realities. Everything changed when the last echoes of the Cleveland street scandal finally died down in late 1890, leaving behind a landscape that looked familiar on the surface, but operated according to completely different rules underneath. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. There was no single moment when someone announced, "The old ways are finished. Here's how we do things now." Instead, it was like watching a city rebuild after an earthquake, where the new structures looked similar to what came before, but were designed according to hard-learned lessons about what could survive and what would inevitably collapse. The key realization that swept through London's sexual underground was that size and visibility had become liabilities rather than assets. The grand establishments like Cleveland Street, with their fixed locations, regular staff, and high-profile clientele, had been impressive demonstrations of entrepreneurial success. But they had also been sitting ducks for anyone who wanted to bring them down. The new wisdom was that survival required fragmentation, mobility, and above all, deniability that could withstand the kind of intensive investigation that had destroyed Hammond's operation. This shift was driven by several factors that converged in the aftermath of the scandal. First, the government had demonstrated that it was willing to sacrifice anyone, including aristocrats and military officers, if political pressure became too intense. The protection that wealth and social status had previously provided was revealed to be conditional and unreliable. Second, the press had shown that sexual scandals could sell newspapers and advance political careers, creating incentives for journalists and politicians to seek out and expose underground activities. Third, the moral reform movement had gained political influence and organizational sophistication that made them more effective opponents than they had been in the past. But perhaps most importantly, the scandal had revealed that the elaborate systems of mutual protection and discretion that had allowed large-scale operations to flourish were fundamentally unstable. Too many people had known too much about each other's activities, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by investigators, blackmailers, or political enemies. The interconnected networks that had made the Victorian sexual underground so efficient and profitable had also made it catastrophically vulnerable to exposure. The new model that emerged was based on principles that would be familiar to modern organized crime experts: cellular organization, where individual operators knew as little as possible about each other's activities, multiple layers of intermediaries between clients and providers, and constant movement that made it difficult for authorities to track or infiltrate operations. It was less efficient and probably less profitable than the old system, but it was much more survivable. What made this transformation particularly interesting was that it happened without any central coordination or planning. There was no underground council that met to redesign the entire system. Instead, individual entrepreneurs and operators independently reached similar conclusions about what needed to change and began implementing new approaches that gradually coalesced into industry-wide standards. It was like watching evolution in real time, as survival pressures selected for characteristics that improved security and eliminated practices that had proven vulnerable to exposure. The most successful adapters were those who had been peripheral to the Cleveland Street network, small-scale operators who had learned from the scandal without being directly damaged by it. They became the innovators who developed new methods that would define the underground world for the rest of the Victorian era and beyond. These weren't isolated incidents happening in separate corners of London. They were all part of an interconnected web of relationships, financial arrangements, and information networks that linked virtually everyone involved in London's underground sexual economy. The connections were so extensive that investigating any one case inevitably led to discoveries about dozens of others, creating a cascading effect that police and government officials found increasingly difficult to control. George Veck's photographic business, for example, wasn't just connected to Cleveland Street through shared clientele. He actually provided services to Hammond's operation, taking promotional photographs that were used to advertise particular young men to potential clients. These weren't crude pornographic images, but sophisticated portraits that emphasized youth, innocence, and availability in ways that informed viewers could decode while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved. Veck essentially invented the concept of escort advertising, creating images that sold fantasy and desire without explicitly depicting sexual activity. The financial networks were particularly complex because they had to operate within the constraints of Victorian banking systems while serving clients who needed absolute discretion. Money moved through a series of intermediaries, false names, and indirect transactions that would have impressed modern money launderers. Hammond, for instance, didn't just collect fees directly from clients. He operated through a network of agents, intermediaries, and front businesses that made it nearly impossible to trace financial connections between specific clients as specific. Services. One of the most surprising discoveries was that several of London's most respectable gentlemen's clubs were unknowingly serving as informal coordination centers for this underground economy. Clients would meet at their clubs to exchange information about services, providers, and opportunities, using the kind of coded language that club members were accustomed to using for discussing other discrete matters like gambling debts or extramarital affairs. The clubs provided perfect cover because members regularly discussed business and social connections that required discretion. So conversations about interesting young men or private entertainment didn't attract attention from staff or other members. The information networks were sophisticated enough to include early warning systems about police activity, government investigations, and social gossip that might threaten participants. News about raids, arrests, or investigations spread through this community faster than through official channels, allowing people to take protective action before authorities could act. During the Cleveland Street investigation, for example, several potential witnesses disappeared from London days before police attempted to interview them, suggesting that they had received advance warning from sources within law enforcement. Political connections created the most complex web of all, because many clients were men who had significant influence over the very laws and institutions that were supposed to be prosecuting them. Members of Parliament who frequented male brothels were often involved in drafting legislation about sexual offenses. Military officers who purchased sexual services from young men were responsible for enforcing discipline and moral standards within their commands. Church officials who engaged prostitutes were simultaneously preaching about moral purity and sexual restraint. These contradictions created opportunities for mutual protection and mutual destruction that influenced political decision-making in ways that are probably still not fully understood. The international connections were equally important because the British Empire's global reach meant that individuals involved in London's sexual underground often had business, military, or colonial connections that extended across continents. When scandals threatened to break, participants could disappear into colonial administrations, military postings, or business opportunities in India, Australia, or other imperial territories where their backgrounds would be less likely to attract scrutiny. The empire essentially provided a global witness protection program for people fleeing sexual scandals. Perhaps most fascinatingly, the social reform movements that were supposedly fighting against sexual vice were sometimes connected to the same networks they were trying to expose. Some reformers had personal knowledge of the underground world that informed their campaigns, but also compromised their ability to speak openly about what they knew. Others were former participants who had found religious conversion or moral awakening, bringing insider knowledge to their reform efforts, but also creating vulnerabilities to blackmail or exposure. The result was a reform movement that was often remarkably well-informed about the realities of sexual commerce, but constrained in how directly it could address those realities. Everything changed when the last echoes of the Cleveland Street scandal finally died down in late 1890, leaving behind a landscape that looked familiar on the surface, but operated according to completely different rules underneath. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. There was no single moment when someone announced, "The old ways are finished. Here's how we do things now." Instead, it was like watching a city rebuild after an earthquake, where the new structures looked similar to what came before, but were designed according to hard-learned lessons about what could survive. And what would inevitably collapse stopped the key realization that swept through London's sexual underground was that size and visibility had become liabilities rather than assets. The grand establishments like Cleveland Street, with their fixed locations, regular staff, and high-profile clientele, had been impressive demonstrations of entrepreneurial success. The Bay had also been sitting ducks for anyone who wanted to bring them down. The new wisdom was that survival required fragmentation, mobility, and above all, deniability that could withstand the kind of intensive investigation that had destroyed Hammond's operation. This shift was driven by several factors that converged in the aftermath of the scandal. First, the government had demonstrated that it was willing to sacrifice anyone, including aristocrats and military officers, if political pressure became too intense. The protection that wealth and social status had previously provided was revealed to be conditional and unreliable. Second, the press had shown that sexual scandals could sell newspapers and advance political careers, creating incentives for journalists and politicians to seek out and expose underground activities. Third, the moral reform movement had gained political influence and organizational sophistication that made them more effective opponents than they had been in the past. But perhaps most importantly, the scandal had revealed that the elaborate systems of mutual protection and discretion that had allowed large-scale operations to flourish were fundamentally unstable. Too many people had known too much about each other's activities, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by investigators, blackmailers, or political enemies. The interconnected networks that had made the Victorian sexual underground so efficient and profitable had also made it catastrophically vulnerable to exposure. The new model that emerged was based on principles that would be familiar to modern organized crime experts, cellular organization, where individual operators knew as little as possible about each other's activities, multiple layers of intermediaries between clients and providers, and constant movement that made it difficult for authorities to track or infiltrate operations. It was less efficient and probably less profitable than the old system, but it was much more survivable. What made this transformation particularly interesting was that it happened without any central coordination or planning. There was no underground council that met to redesign the entire system. Instead, individual entrepreneurs and operators independently reached similar conclusions about what needed to change and began implementing new approaches that gradually coalesced into industry-wide standards. It was like watching evolution in real time, as survival pressures selected for characteristics that improved security, and eliminated practices that had proven vulnerable to exposure. The most successful adapters were those who had been peripheral to the Cleveland Street network, small-scale operators who had learned from the scandal without being directly damaged by it. They became the innovators who developed new methods that would define the underground world for the rest of the Victorian era and beyond. The most significant development was the emergence of what historians now recognize as the first truly modern gay subculture in London. Unlike the previous system, which had been primarily organized around commercial transactions between clients and providers, the new networks began developing their own social institutions, cultural practices, and community identity that went far beyond simple sexual commerce. Private clubs emerged that offered literary discussions, artistic salons, and social gatherings that served the same community-building functions as conventional Victorian institutions, but for men whose sexual interests made them unwelcome in mainstream society. These developments were driven partly by necessity. The fragmented, post-Cleveland Street environment required better communication and coordination systems, but also by the realization that the underground world could provide social benefits that weren't available anywhere else in Victorian society. For men who were attracted to other men, these networks offered the only spaces where they could be honest about their desires, form genuine friendships with like-minded individuals, and develop relationships that weren't purely transactional. The economic foundations of this emerging subculture were more diverse and sophisticated than the previous system had been. While prostitution remained an important component, it was supplemented by other forms of mutual support. Informal job placement networks that helped community members find employment with sympathetic employers, lending circles that provided financial assistance during difficult periods, and business partnerships that allowed members to pool resources for ventures that might not have been possible individually. New challenges emerged that the old system hadn't faced. The increased security requirements made it more difficult for newcomers to find their way into the community, creating a potential problem with recruitment and renewal that threatened the long-term sustainability of the networks. The higher costs of operations meant that participation was increasingly limited to men with substantial financial resources, potentially excluding the working-class men who had been important participants in the previous system. More seriously, the fragmented structure made the community more vulnerable to infiltration by blackmailers, police informants, and confidence men who could exploit the trust that was necessary for the system to function. Several spectacular cases in the mid-1890s involved individuals who had gained access to networks by posing as legitimate participants, then used their insider knowledge to extort money from other members or sell information to newspapers and government investigators. The response to these challenges involved developing even more sophisticated screening and security procedures. But these measures created their own problems by making the community increasingly insular and suspicious of outsiders. What had begun as a survival mechanism was evolving into something that resembled a secret society, complete with initiation procedures, loyalty tests, and internal discipline systems that could be harsh for members who violated community standards. The transformed landscape attracted a completely different type of entrepreneur than had dominated the pre-Cleveland Street era, where the previous generation had been led by individuals like Charles Hammond, who operated relatively straightforward commercial establishments. The new leaders were often more sophisticated operators who understood that success required integration with legitimate business and social networks rather than simple isolation from them. The most successful of these new entrepreneurs was probably Frederick Park, who had actually been involved in earlier scandals but had learned from those experiences and reinvented himself as a legitimate businessman who happened to have extensive social connections in London's underground world. Park operated a series of seemingly legitimate enterprises, an art gallery, a private club, and a small publishing house that provided perfect cover for activities that had nothing to do with their official purposes. His genius was recognizing that the new environment required operators who could function successfully in both the legitimate and underground worlds simultaneously. Park's art gallery became a model for how the new system could work. The gallery hosted regular exhibitions that attracted genuine art lovers and serious collectors, establishing Park's reputation as a legitimate cultural figure. But the gallery also served as a meeting place for men with shared interests that had nothing to do with art appreciation. Opening night receptions provided opportunities for introductions and private conversations, while the gallery's back rooms could be used for activities that weren't typically associated with cultural events. The beauty of this arrangement was that everyone who visited the gallery had plausible reasons for being there. That had nothing to do with sexual commerce. Another significant new player was Dr. Maurice Richardson, a physician who discovered that his medical practice provided unusual opportunities for community service that weren't typically available to Victorian doctors. Richardson began offering discreet medical services to members of the underground community, treating sexually transmitted diseases without asking uncomfortable questions and providing medical certificates that could be used to explain suspicious absences from work or social obligations. His practice became an informal community center where information could be exchanged and social connections could be made under the cover of medical consultations. Richardson's contribution went beyond simple medical services. He also became a crucial source of information about police activities, government investigations, and social gossip that might affect community members. His legitimate social standing gave him access to information from official sources, while his underground connections provided him with intelligence about activities that authorities might be planning to investigate. He essentially functioned as an early warning system that helped community members avoid the kind of exposure that had destroyed the Cleveland Street network. The theater world produced its own new generation of leaders who had learned to navigate the changed environment more successfully than their predecessors. Oscar Wilde, before his own spectacular downfall, had become a central figure in networks that connected artistic, literary, and sexual communities in ways that were more sophisticated than anything that had existed before. Wilde's approach was to use his legitimate celebrity and social connections to create opportunities for men who shared his interest to meet and interact in environments that appeared completely respectable on the surface. The most innovative new players were probably the individuals who figured out how to use emerging technologies to serve community needs in ways that hadn't been possible before. The expansion of the telegraph system, improvements in postal services, and the growth of newspaper advertising created new possibilities for communication and coordination that didn't require face-to-face meetings or physical gathering places. These technological entrepreneurs developed coded communication systems, anonymous mailing services, and advertising strategies that allowed community members to connect with each other while maintaining the security and discretion that the new environment required. But some problems persisted, despite all the innovations and adaptations that had emerged since Cleveland Street. The fundamental tension between the community's need for security and its need for growth continued to create challenges that were never satisfactorily resolved. The screening procedures that protected established members from infiltration also made it nearly impossible for newcomers to gain access, creating a potential demographic crisis as older members aged out of active participation without being replaced by younger recruits. The economic pressures had also intensified rather than diminished over time. The costs of maintaining the security measures and complex operational procedures that the new system required meant that participation was increasingly expensive, both for operators and for clients. This created a vicious cycle where rising costs excluded potential participants which reduced the customer base, which required higher fees from remaining clients, which further reduced participation. By the late 1890s, some community leaders were beginning to worry that the system was pricing itself out of existence. The relationship with law enforcement remained problematic and unpredictable. While the new distributed structure made large-scale raids less likely, it also made individual participants more vulnerable to targeted investigation and prosecution. Police had learned from the Cleveland Street experience and were developing more sophisticated investigative techniques that could be effective against the new operational methods. The result was a constant arms race between community security measures and police investigative capabilities that required continuous adaptation and vigilance. Blackmail remained a persistent threat that was arguably worse in the new environment than it had been under the old system. The fragmented structure meant that individual blackmailers could operate more easily without being detected by community leaders, while the increased paranoia and security consciousness made it harder for victims to seek help or organize collective responses to extortion attempts. Several prominent cases in the 1890s involved community members who had been systematically exploited by blackmailers for years, without anyone else knowing about their situation. The generational divide within the community was creating new forms of tension that hadn't existed in the previous system. Older members who had experienced the more relaxed atmosphere of the pre-Cleveland Street era often clashed with younger participants who had only known the high-security environment and who had different expectations about community life and personal relationships. These conflicts sometimes erupted into serious disputes that threatened the unity and effectiveness of entire networks. Medical issues were becoming more serious as the community aged and as sexually transmitted diseases continued to spread despite improved awareness and prevention efforts. The discreet medical services that people like Dr. Richardson provided were helpful, but they couldn't address the broader public health challenges that the community faced. The secrecy that was necessary for security also made it difficult to share information about health risks and prevention strategies, creating conditions where diseases could spread rapidly through networks before anyone realized what was happening. International connections had become both more important and more complicated as the British Empire expanded and as communication and transportation technologies improved. Community members could more easily travel to other cities and countries, but they also faced new risks from foreign laws and social customs that might be less tolerant than what they were accustomed to in London. Several cases involved British citizens who had been arrested in colonial territories for activities that would have been handled discreetly in London, creating diplomatic complications and potential security breaches that could affect the entire community. Perhaps most troubling was the growing realization that the community's success in adapting to post-Cleveland street conditions had created new vulnerabilities that might ultimately prove more dangerous than the original problems the adaptations had been designed to solve. Compared to the pre-Cleveland Street era, the underground world of the 1890s was simultaneously more sophisticated and more constrained, more successful in some ways and more vulnerable in others. The comparison reveals how institutional pressure can drive innovation, but also create new forms of inequality and exclusion that weren't present in the original system. The most obvious difference was in scale and accessibility. The earlier system had been relatively open to newcomers and had served a broad economic range of participants, from wealthy aristocrats to working-class telegraph boys. The new system was much more exclusive and expensive, serving primarily upper-middle-class and wealthy clients, while largely excluding the working-class men who had been important participants in the previous era. This represented a significant loss of economic opportunity for some of London's most vulnerable young men, who found themselves cut off from income sources that had previously been available to them. In terms of security and longevity, The new system was clearly superior. The distributed structure and sophisticated operational procedures that had emerged after Cleveland Street proved much more resistant to investigation and disruption than the large, centralized establishments that had previously dominated the scene. Individual networks might be compromised, but the overall system was much more resilient and harder for authorities to understand or disrupt effectively. The social and cultural dimensions showed the most dramatic evolution. Where the earlier system had been primarily transactional, focused on commercial exchanges between clients and providers, the new networks had developed rich community cultures that provided social support, cultural activities, and personal relationships that went far beyond sexual commerce. This represented a genuine advance in terms of human dignity and social connection, creating opportunities for authentic relationships and community belonging that hadn't existed in the previous era. What was unique about London's experience compared to other cities was the speed and thoroughness of the transformation that followed the Cleveland Street scandal. Other European cities with similar underground scenes, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, had evolved more gradually and hadn't developed the same level of sophisticated organization that characterized London's post-1890 networks. This probably reflected both the severity of the crisis that Cleveland Street had created and the particular characteristics of British social and political culture that made both repression and adaptation more intense than they were elsewhere. What was universal about London's experience was the demonstration that sexual communities could adapt to hostile environments by developing alternative social institutions that served the same functions as mainstream organizations while operating according to different principles. The techniques that London's underground community developed: coded communication, cellular organization, integration with legitimate businesses, sophisticated screen procedures, would be adopted and refined by sexual minorities in other times and places facing similar challenges. The lessons that could be learned from London's experience were complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, the community's success in surviving and adapting to repression demonstrated remarkable resilience and creativity. On the other hand, the costs of that survival, in terms of exclusion, expense, and constant vigilance, raised questions about whether the benefits were worth the price that had to be paid to obtain them. By the mid-1890s, several warning signs pointed to another major upheaval coming for London's carefully reconstructed underground world. Though most participants were either too comfortable with their success or too focused on immediate concerns to recognize the approaching storm. The sophisticated networks that had emerged after Cleveland Street had become victims of their own success, developing a confidence and visibility that would have horrified the cautious operators who had first learned to navigate the post-scandal environment. The most obvious danger signal was the growing celebrity of Oscar Wilde, whose flamboyant public persona and barely concealed relationships with young men were making him a lightning rod for exactly the kind of attention that the underground community had spent years learning to avoid. Wilde's approach to managing his double life was the complete opposite of the discretion and careful compartmentalization that had become standard practice after Cleveland Street. Instead of hiding his activities, he seemed to be daring society to confront him about them, apparently believing that his literary fame and social connections would protect him from serious consequences. What key players could see, but chose to ignore, was that Wilde's recklessness was creating vulnerability for everyone connected to his networks. His relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas was conducted with such public drama that it had become the subject of gossip in fashionable drawing rooms across London. His association with young men from the theater world was so obvious that newspaper columnists were beginning to make veiled references to it in their society reporting. Most dangerously, his legal disputes with Douglas's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, were creating exactly the kind of public controversy that could force authorities to take action they might otherwise prefer to avoid. What they missed was the broader political and social context that was making the underground world more vulnerable than it had been since the immediate aftermath of Cleveland Street. The 1890s had seen the rise of a more aggressive and politically connected moral reform movement that was specifically targeting sexual vice as a way of advancing broader social and political agendas. These reformers had learned from the Cleveland Street experience and were developing more sophisticated strategies for exposing and disrupting underground networks. The press environment had also changed in ways that made sexual scandals more dangerous for everyone involved. The growth of mass circulation newspapers had created new commercial incentives for sensational reporting, while improvements in printing technology and distribution networks meant that scandals could spread more quickly and reach larger audiences than had been possible in the past. The relatively genteel press coverage that had characterized the Cleveland Street affair would seem quaint compared to what was coming. Resistance to inevitable change came primarily from community leaders who had invested too much in the existing system to acknowledge its vulnerabilities. The networks that had emerged in the 1890s represented years of careful relationship building, institutional development, and financial investment that couldn't easily be abandoned or restructured. Many operators had become so successful within the current system that they couldn't imagine any alternative approach, while others had developed such elaborate security procedures that they believed they were immune to the kind of exposure that had destroyed earlier networks. The international dimension added another layer of complexity that few participants fully understood. The British Empire's global reach meant that scandals in London could have diplomatic and political consequences that extended far beyond Britain itself, potentially affecting relationships with other European powers and colonial territories where British prestige was crucial for maintaining control. The final collapse began not with a police raid or a government investigation, but with a piece of cardboard left at a gentleman's club. In February 1895, the Marquis of Queensberry left a calling card at the Albemarle Club addressed for Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite, the misspelling somehow making the accusation even more insulting than if it had been spelled correctly. This single act of aristocratic rage would ultimately destroy not just Wilde's career and reputation, but the entire elaborate network of relationships, institutions, and protective arrangements that had sustained London's underground community. For over a decade, Wilde's decision to sue Queensberry for libel was the kind of catastrophic miscalculation that historians study as an example of how personal pride can override rational risk assessment. Any experienced member of the underground community could have told him that initiating legal proceedings would inevitably require presenting evidence about his private life that could only end in disaster. But Wilde had apparently convinced himself that his celebrity status and literary reputation would intimidate Queensberry into backing down, or that the legal system would somehow protect him from the consequences of his own recklessness. The libel trial that began in April 1895 was like watching a slow-motion explosion that destroyed everything in its path. Queensberry's defense team, led by Edward Carson, had conducted thorough research into Wilde's relationships and activities, gathering evidence and witnesses that painted a detailed picture of exactly the kind of life that Victorian society officially refused to acknowledge existed. The testimony didn't just expose Wilde's individual behavior. It revealed the entire social and economic infrastructure that had made his lifestyle possible. Carson's cross-examination of Wilde was a masterpiece of legal destruction that systematically demolished every aspect of the carefully constructed facade that had protected the underground community. The questioning revealed the role of intermediaries like Alfred Taylor, the economics of relationships between older men and young working-class men, the use of hotels and private clubs for activities that had nothing to do with their official purposes, and the networks of mutual protection and financial support that connected participants across London society. When the libel case collapsed and Wilde was arrested on charges of gross indecency, the panic that swept through London's underground networks was immediate and comprehensive. Within hours of Wilde's arrest, men were fleeing to France, burning correspondence, and desperately trying to establish alibis for activities that had previously seemed completely secure. The carefully constructed world of private clubs, artistic salons, and theatrical connections that had provided cover for underground activities was revealed to be as fragile as a house of cards when subjected to serious legal and media scrutiny. Alfred Taylor, who had been such a successful operator in the post-Cleveland Street environment, was arrested along with Wilde and became a key figure in the prosecution's case. The detailed testimony about Taylor's parties and social connections provided prosecutors with a roadmap to the entire underground community that was far more comprehensive than anything that had emerged from the Cleveland Street investigation. Taylor's arrest was particularly devastating because he had been so successful at building bridges between different parts of the community that his exposure compromised virtually everyone who had been active in the London scene. The trials that followed Wilde's first trial ended in a hung jury, but his second trial resulted in conviction and a sentence of 2 years hard labor provided unprecedented public documentation of how London's underground world actually operated. The newspaper coverage was exhaustive and sensational, providing the general public with detailed information about activities and relationships that had previously been hidden from view. The trials essentially served as a public education campaign about the existence and organization of same-sex sexual networks in Victorian London. The most dramatic final moments came not during the trials themselves, but in the weeks that followed as the secondary effects of the scandal rippled through London society. Men who had never been directly connected to Wilde found themselves under suspicion, investigation, or social pressure that forced them to abandon activities, relationships, and social connections that had been central to their lives. The underground community that had taken years to build was effectively destroyed within months, as participants either fled the country, retreated into complete isolation, or attempted to reconstruct their public identities as conventional Victorian gentlemen who had never been involved in anything questionable. The collapse of London's 1890s underground world wasn't the result of a single cause, but rather the convergence of multiple factors that created a perfect storm of vulnerability and exposure. Understanding why it ended so completely and dramatically requires recognizing how different types of pressure combined to overwhelm even the sophisticated defensive measures that the community had developed over the previous decade. The internal problems were perhaps the most serious because they had been building for years without being adequately addressed. The community's success in the 1890s had created a false sense of security that led to increasingly careless behavior by participants who had forgotten the lessons of Cleveland Street. The elaborate screening procedures and security measures that had initially protected the networks had gradually been relaxed as operators became more confident and as the immediate memory of the earlier scandal faded. By 1895, many participants were operating with a level of openness and visibility that would have been unthinkable in the immediate aftermath of Cleveland Street. External pressures had also been building in ways that most community members hadn't fully appreciated. The moral reform movement had become more sophisticated and better organized, developing new strategies for investigating and exposing sexual vice that were specifically designed to counter the defensive measures that underground networks had adopted. At the same time, changes in newspaper publishing and mass communication had created new incentives for sensational reporting that made sexual scandals more profitable and more dangerous than they had been in the past. The role of individual participants, particularly Oscar Wilde, was crucial in creating the specific conditions that made the collapse so dramatic and comprehensive. Wilde's celebrity status had made him a natural target for anyone seeking to attack the underground community, while his personal relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas had created specific legal and social vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile forces. His decision to initiate legal proceedings against Queensberry was the catalyst that transformed simmering tensions into open warfare. But the underlying conditions that made such a devastating outcome possible had been developing for years. Historical forces also played a role that was largely beyond the control of individual participants. The 1890s were a period of significant social and political change in Britain, with growing tensions about gender roles, sexual morality, and social hierarchy. That made sexual nonconformity a particularly sensitive issue. The underground community had developed during a period of relative political stability, but by the mid-1890s, broader social anxieties were creating demand for scapegoats and moral crusades that could serve political purposes beyond their stated objectives. What could have been done differently is a question that has fascinated historians and social observers for over a century. Some argue that the community could have survived if it had maintained the strict security measures and low profile that had characterized the immediate post-Cleveland Street period. Others suggest that the fundamental problem was the community's dependence on wealthy and prominent participants whose celebrity made them inherently vulnerable to exposure and attack. The question of inevitability versus contingency is particularly complex in this case. On one hand, the specific circumstances that led to Wilde's trials, his relationship with Douglas, Queensberry's hostility, the particular legal strategies that were employed, were highly contingent and might not have occurred under slightly different circumstances. On the other hand, the broader social and political pressures that made the underground community vulnerable were probably inevitable given the trajectory of Victorian social development and the growing political influence of moral reform movements. The most telling aspect of the community's collapse was how quickly and completely it happened, suggesting that the apparent stability and security that had characterized the 1890s networks had been more fragile than anyone realized at the time. The immediate aftermath of the Wilde trials was a period of social reorganization that affected far more people than had been directly involved in the underground networks. Victorian London suddenly found itself grappling with public knowledge about activities and relationships that had previously been kept carefully hidden, creating a crisis of cognitive dissonance that required new forms of social accommodation and denial. Who stepped into the vacuum left by the destroyed networks varied significantly depending on the specific communities and relationships that had been disrupted. In some cases, more cautious operators who had maintained distance from the Wilde circle attempted to rebuild on a much smaller and more discreet scale, learning from the mistakes that had led to the recent disaster. These new networks were often international in scope, taking advantage of improved transportation and communication to create relationships that crossed national boundaries and were therefore harder for any single government to monitor or disrupt. The short-term consequences for participants were severe and unevenly distributed. Working-class men who had been involved in the networks often faced the harshest immediate consequences: unemployment, social ostracism, and sometimes physical violence from family members or communities that had learned about their activities through newspaper coverage of the trials. Middle-class participants typically had more resources for rebuilding their lives, but they often faced professional and social consequences that could last for years or decades. Contemporary reactions revealed the deep contradictions in Victorian attitudes towards sexuality and morality that the underground networks had both exploited and reflected. Public condemnation of Wilde and others was fierce and widespread, but private reactions were often more complex and ambivalent. Many people who publicly supported the prosecutions privately worried about the implications of the government's willingness to investigate and punish private consensual behavior between adults. The legal system's response was to tighten enforcement of existing laws while avoiding any examination of the social conditions that had made underground networks attractive to participants. Police departments received additional resources for investigating sexual offenses, but there was no corresponding effort to address the economic inequality or social isolation that had made prostitution and other forms of sexual commerce appealing to working-class young men. Attempts at revival or continuation were generally unsuccessful in the immediate aftermath of the trials, partly because the publicity had made everyone involved too recognizable, and partly because the social and legal environment had become too hostile to support the kind of organized activity that had characterized the 1890s networks. Some individuals maintained private relationships and informal social connections, but the institutional infrastructure that has supported community life was largely destroyed and wouldn't be rebuilt for decades. The international implications were significant, as other European countries used the Wilde scandal as evidence of British moral corruption while simultaneously conducting their own crackdowns on similar activities within their own borders. The trials became a reference point for discussions about sexual morality and legal policy across Europe and America, influencing legislation and enforcement practices in countries that had their own underground sexual communities. Perhaps most importantly, the immediate legacy included the creation of new forms of secrecy and compartmentalization that would influence British sexual culture well into the 20th century. The legacy of Victorian London's underground sexual world shaped later developments in ways that are still visible today, creating patterns of community organization, legal resistance, and cultural expression that would be recognized and adapted by subsequent generations facing similar challenges. The techniques developed between Cleveland Street and Oscar Wilde's trials became a blueprint for how sexual minorities could survive and thrive under hostile legal and social conditions, influencing everything from early 20th century homosexual rights movements to modern LGBTQ+ activism. The most significant immediate influence was on the development of international networks that connected sexual minorities across national boundaries. The destruction of London's domestic underground community in the 1890s had demonstrated the vulnerability of localized networks to government action, leading survivors to develop relationships that spanned multiple countries and legal jurisdictions. These international connections became crucial during both World Wars, when legal and social pressures on sexual minorities intensified across Europe, and they provided models for the global LGBTQ rights movement that emerged in the mid-20th century. Later generations viewed the Victorian experience through multiple lenses that often reflected their own political and social agendas as much as historical reality. Early homosexual rights activists in the 1920s and 1930s often romanticized figures like Oscar Wilde while downplaying the commercial aspects of the underground networks, preferring to focus on artistic and literary connections that seemed more respectable and politically useful. Post-World War, two gay liberation movements took a more confrontational approach, viewing the Victorian underground's emphasis on secrecy and respectability as evidence of internalized oppression that needed to be overcome through visibility and political action. The myths that developed around Victorian sexual underground often obscured the complex realities of how these communities actually functioned. Popular culture representations typically focused on dramatic scandals and celebrity figures while ignoring the economic relationships and survival strategies that had made the networks possible in the first place. This selective memory created romanticized versions of Victorian gay life that emphasized artistic creativity and tragic romance while minimizing the harsh realities of criminalization, economic exploitation, and social violence that most participants had faced. Why certain aspects remained important while others were forgotten often reflected changing political priorities and social conditions rather than historical significance. The community-building techniques developed in the 1890s continued to influence sexual minority organizing well into the 20th century, but the specific methods of economic organization and client-provider relationships were largely abandoned as social and legal conditions changed. The emphasis on coded communication and alternative social institutions proved more durable, being adapted for use in very different contexts throughout the 20th century. The influence on British legal and social policy was profound and long-lasting. The Wilde trials had demonstrated both the power of legal persecution and its limitations, showing that while individual prosecutions could destroy lives and communities, they couldn't eliminate the underlying social conditions that made underground networks attractive to participants. This realization gradually led to more sophisticated approaches to regulating sexual behavior that focused on public order and protection of minors, rather than attempting to control all forms of non-conforming sexuality. Academic and scholarly interest in Victorian sexual underground didn't develop until the mid-20th century, when historians began recognizing these communities as important subjects for social and cultural analysis rather than simply moral cautionary tales. This scholarship revealed the sophistication and complexity of Victorian sexual networks while also documenting their connections to broader social and economic systems, influencing how historians understood the relationship between sexuality, class, and political power in modern societies. The most lasting impact may have been on British cultural attitudes toward the relationship between private behavior and public morality. The Victorian experience had demonstrated both the costs of enforcing moral conformity and the resilience of human communities in adapting to hostile environments, creating a cultural memory that would influence British responses to later moral controversies and social changes. Today, we can see clear echoes of Victorian London's underground sexual networks in a surprising variety of modern contexts, from online dating communities to contemporary sex work organizing to the global networks that connect LGBTQ+ people across cultures and legal systems. The fundamental challenges that Victorian sexual minorities faced: how to build community under hostile legal conditions, how to balance security with accessibility, how to create economic opportunities while minimizing risk, remain relevant for many marginalized communities in the 21st century. The most obvious parallel is in how modern sex workers organize for safety and economic protection in legal environments that criminalize their activities. Contemporary sex worker advocacy groups use many of the same strategies that Victorian prostitutes developed: careful screening of clients, information sharing about dangerous individuals, mutual aid networks that provide financial and emotional support, and sophisticated communication systems that allow coordination while maintaining operational security. The cellular organization and distributed leadership that emerged after Cleveland Street can be seen in modern sex worker collectives that avoid centralized structures that could be easily targeted by law enforcement. Digital technology has created new possibilities for these organizing strategies while also creating new vulnerabilities that echo Victorian experiences. Online platforms allow for unprecedented coordination and community building among people who might never meet in person. But they also create digital trails that can be monitored by authorities or exploited by hostile actors. The constant tension between visibility and security that characterized Victorian networks is replicated in modern debates about whether LGBTQ+ people should use dating apps. participate in social media, or engage in online activism that could expose them to harassment or legal persecution. What hasn't changed about human nature is the fundamental need for community, intimacy, and economic security that drove Victorian networks in the first place. People still seek ways to connect with others who share their experiences and desires. They still need economic opportunities that provide dignity and autonomy. And they still require social support systems that mainstream institutions often fail to provide. The specific methods for meeting these needs have evolved with technology and social change, but the underlying motivations remain remarkably consistent across time periods and cultural contexts. Similar patterns appear in different contexts whenever marginalized communities face hostile legal or social environments. Contemporary examples include undocumented immigrants who create informal networks for employment, housing, and legal assistance, religious minorities who develop alternative social institutions that serve needs that mainstream organizations won't address, and political dissidents who use coded communication and cellular organization to coordinate activities under authoritarian governments. The Victorian sexual underground provides a case study in community resilience that has influenced organizing strategies across a wide range of social justice movements. The economic dimensions of Victorian networks also have modern parallels in the gig economy and alternative economic arrangements that operate outside traditional employment systems. The informal job placement networks, lending circles, and business partnerships that emerged in the 1890s underground community resemble contemporary peer-to-peer economic platforms, cooperative businesses, and mutual aid organizations that provide economic security for people who are excluded from or exploited by mainstream economic institutions. International aspects of Victorian networks can be seen in modern global LGBTQ organizing, particularly in how activists in countries with repressive laws maintain connections with supporters in more liberal jurisdictions. The safe house networks, financial support systems, and information sharing arrangements that connected Victorian London with cities across Europe and America have evolved into sophisticated international human rights organizations that provide resources and coordination for LGBTQ people worldwide. Perhaps most significantly, the Victorian experience demonstrates how technological and social changes can rapidly transform the landscape for marginalized communities, sometimes creating new opportunities and sometimes destroying established support systems. The same communication technologies that allowed Victorian networks to become more sophisticated also made them more vulnerable to surveillance and exposure. Modern communities face similar challenges as digital platforms create new possibilities for connection and organizing, while also creating new risks from surveillance, harassment, and algorithmic discrimination. The lessons for contemporary issues are complex and sometimes contradictory. Victorian networks succeeded by adapting constantly to changing conditions, but they also failed when they became too visible or too confident in their security measures. Modern movements can learn from both the successes and failures of their Victorian predecessors, particularly the importance of balancing accessibility with security and the need to maintain community solidarity while avoiding the kinds of internal conflicts that can make communities vulnerable to external attack. Even now, Victorian London's sexual underground influences multiple areas of contemporary culture and politics in ways that are often invisible to people who aren't specifically looking for these connections. Academic study of LGBTQ history regularly references the Cleveland Street scandal and Oscar Wilde trials as foundational moments in modern gay identity formation, while scholars working on sex work history use Victorian networks as examples of how communities can organize for mutual protection and economic advancement under criminalized conditions. Popular culture representations of Victorian gay life continue to draw heavily on the personalities and events from this era, though often in ways that sanitize or romanticize the harsh realities that most participants faced. Films, television shows, and novels about Oscar Wilde typically focus on his wit and artistic genius while minimizing his connections to commercial sexual networks, while historical fiction about Victorian London often includes gay characters whose lives bear little resemblance to the documented experiences of actual underground community members. Political discourse about sex work regulation and LGBTQ+ rights frequently invokes Victorian precedents, though often inaccurately or selectively. Advocates for sex work decriminalization sometimes point to Victorian experiences as evidence that criminalization drives underground activities into more dangerous forms, while opponents use the same historical examples to argue that tolerance of commercial sex leads to broader social corruption. Contemporary debates about age of consent laws, public morality legislation, and the regulation of online sexual content often reference Victorian legal precedents and social controversies. Social movements continue to adapt organizational techniques that were developed or refined by Victorian sexual minorities, particularly methods for building community across class and cultural differences, creating economic opportunities outside mainstream systems, and maintaining group solidarity under legal and social pressure. The influence is often indirect and mediated through multiple generations of activists and organizers, but the basic strategies remain recognizable to anyone familiar with how Victorian networks actually functioned. Why people still care about these historical experiences reflects continuing struggles for sexual freedom, economic justice, and community autonomy that connect contemporary movements with their Victorian predecessors in ways that transcend specific historical circumstances. Looking back across this hidden chapter of Victorian London, we've traveled through a world that was simultaneously more complex and more human than the simplified narratives of sexual repression and moral hypocrisy that usually characterize our understanding of this era. The men who built these networks, entrepreneurs like Charles Hammond and Alfred Taylor, survivors like Henry Newlove and John Saul, innovators like Frederick Park and Dr. Maurice Richardson, were responding to the same fundamental human needs for community, economic security, and authentic relationships that drive social organizing in every era. Their stories reveal how creativity, resilience, and mutual support can flourish even under the most hostile conditions, but also how quickly established communities can be destroyed when security measures fail, or when broader political forces create demand for scapegoats and moral crusades. The elaborate systems they created for connecting clients with providers, building trust among strangers, and maintaining operational security under constant threat demonstrate human ingenuity at its most resourceful, while their ultimate destruction reminds us how fragile these achievements can be. Most surprisingly, perhaps these Victorian experiences show us how modern many of their concerns and strategies actually were. The challenges they faced in balancing visibility with security, building inclusive communities while maintaining necessary boundaries, and creating economic opportunities that provided both income and dignity, are challenges that marginalized communities continue to face today, using techniques that would be recognizable to anyone who participated in London's underground networks of the 1880s and 1890s. Their legacy lives on not just in historical archives and academic studies, but in the continuing work of people who build alternative communities, create mutual aid networks, and organize for the radical proposition that everyone deserves safety, dignity, and the opportunity to live authentically, regardless of whom they love or how they express their sexuality. Looking back across the decades we've explored together, from the sophisticated brothels of Cleveland Street to the fragmented networks that emerged after Oscar Wilde's trials, We've witnessed one of the most remarkable examples of human adaptability and community resilience in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. The Victorian underground world of male prostitution wasn't just a footnote in sexual history. It was a laboratory for techniques of social organization, economic innovation, and cultural resistance that would influence marginalized communities for generations to come. The key patterns that emerged from this journey reveal truths about human nature that transcend the specific historical context of Victorian London. We've seen how people facing legal persecution and social ostracism developed elaborate systems of mutual protection and support that were often more sophisticated than the official institutions that were supposed to serve their needs. We've witnessed the constant tension between the need for community visibility that creates belonging and the need for secrecy that ensures survival. And we've observed how economic necessity and human desire can combine to create alternative social worlds that operate according to their own rules and values. The most surprising discoveries along the way challenge virtually every assumption that modern people typically make about Victorian sexuality and social organization. The idea that the 19th century was characterized by sexual repression and rigid moral conformity dissolves when confronted with evidence of thriving underground economies that served thousands of participants across all social classes. The notion that homosexual communities didn't exist before the 20th century becomes impossible to maintain when faced with documentation of elaborate networks that provided social support, economic opportunities, and cultural institutions for men whose desires made them outcasts from mainstream society. Perhaps most importantly, we've seen how the relationship between public morality and private behavior in Victorian society was far more complex and contradictory than the simple narrative of hypocrisy that usually characterizes discussions of this era. The underground networks we've explored weren't just violations of official moral standards. They were alternative social systems that served real human needs that mainstream Victorian institutions couldn't or wouldn't address. The men who participated in these networks weren't just rebels against conventional morality. They were entrepreneurs, community builders, and social innovators who created something genuinely valuable under extraordinarily difficult conditions. How our understanding has evolved throughout this exploration reflects the importance of examining historical experiences from multiple perspectives rather than accepting simplified narratives that reduce complex human experiences to moral lessons or political talking points. The Victorian sexual underground was simultaneously a site of exploitation and empowerment, a space of genuine community and commercial transaction, a world of creative resistance and survival strategy. These contradictions don't represent analytical failures. They represent the genuine complexity of human experience that resists easy categorization or moral judgment. The most important takeaways from this journey may be lessons about how communities can survive and thrive under hostile conditions, how economic and social innovation can emerge from marginalized positions, and how the techniques developed by one generation of survivors can be adapted and refined by subsequent communities facing similar challenges. The Victorian experience provides a case study in community resilience that remains relevant for anyone interested in how people organize for mutual support and collective survival when official institutions fail to meet their needs. Perhaps no single story better encapsulates the broader themes we've explored than the life of Alfred Taylor after his release from prison following the Oscar Wilde trials. Taylor had been one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the post-Cleveland Street underground world, building networks that connected artists, aristocrats, and working-class young men in relationships that provided genuine value for everyone involved. His arrest and conviction had been devastating, not just for him personally, but for the entire community that had depended on his skills as an organizer and facilitator. When Taylor emerged from Pentonville Prison in 1897, he faced a London that had been fundamentally transformed by the publicity surrounding the wild scandal. The networks he had spent years building were gone. Many of his friends and associates had fled the country or retreated into complete social isolation, and his own reputation made it impossible for him to resume his previous activities. By any reasonable measure, his life should have been over. A cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging Victorian moral conventions. Instead, Taylor did something that reveals the deeper truth about the communities we've been exploring. Rather than disappearing into obscurity or attempting to reconstruct his previous life, he began quietly helping other survivors of the scandal rebuild their lives and reconnect with each other. Using skills he had developed as an underground entrepreneur, the ability to bring together people who needed each other, to facilitate relationships while maintaining discretion, to create value through connection and coordination, Taylor became what we might now call a social worker for a community that had no other source of professional support. Taylor's post-prison activities were necessarily much smaller in scale and lower in profile than his previous work, but they served the same essential function of creating spaces where isolated individuals could find community and support. He organized small dinner parties where survivors of the scandal could meet and share their experiences. He maintained correspondence networks that connected people across London and Europe, and he provided practical assistance, financial advice, job referrals, housing recommendations for people who were trying to rebuild their lives under enormously difficult circumstances. What makes Taylor's story so significant is how it demonstrates the persistence of the human values that had motivated the Victorian underground world, even after the specific institutions and networks had been destroyed. The need for community, the impulse to help others facing similar challenges, the skills for creating connection and facilitating mutual support, these survived the legal persecution, social ostracism, and personal tragedy that had destroyed the visible manifestations of underground life. Taylor's later life also reveals how the techniques and relationships developed in the underground world could be adapted for completely different purposes. His experience organizing discrete social events, screening participants for trustworthiness, and maintaining operational security proved valuable for legal political organizing as well as for underground sexual networking. By the early 1900s, Taylor was involved in early homosexual rights organizing that used many of the same methods he had developed for commercial entertainment, but directed toward political goals rather than immediate survival needs. Perhaps most tellingly, Taylor never completely abandoned the economic principles that had governed his underground work. Even in his later activities, he maintained the understanding that sustainable community organizing required attention to everyone's material needs, that effective networks had to provide concrete benefits for participants, and that successful organizing depended on recognizing and working with people's actual motivations rather than their idealized ones. These insights, developed through years of organizing in the Victorian sexual underground, proved remarkably applicable to the very different challenges of early 20th century political activism. The broader significance of Taylor's story lies in how it connects the immediate human experiences we've explored to the longer historical trajectory of social change and community building that extends far beyond the specific context of Victorian sexual underground. What Taylor's story reveals about the broader things we've explored is perhaps best illustrated by a single incident from 1902, nearly a decade after the trials that had supposedly ended the world he had helped create. Taylor was living quietly in a modest flat in Bloomsbury, supporting himself through clerical work and maintaining careful distance from anything that might attract unwanted attention. His life had become the kind of unremarkable existence that Victorian society supposedly preferred for people like him, invisible, harmless and effectively neutralized as a source of social disruption. On a cold evening in November, Taylor received an unexpected visitor, a young man from Manchester who had traveled to London with hopes of finding work in the theatre. The young man had somehow learned of Taylor's reputation and had come, seeking advice about how to survive in a city that could be both welcoming and dangerous for men with unconventional desires. The visitor had no money, no connections, and no realistic understanding of how London actually worked, but he had heard that Taylor might be someone who could provide guidance. What happened next illustrates everything we've learned about how the Victorian underground world actually functioned and why it remained important even after its most visible manifestations had been destroyed. Taylor didn't turn the young man away, but he also didn't immediately offer the kind of assistance that his visitor was probably expecting. Instead, he spent several hours asking careful questions about the young man's background, motivations, and expectations, using the same screening techniques he had developed for organizing underground social events to assess whether this stranger could be trusted and what kind of help would actually be useful. Over the following weeks, Taylor provided his visitor with a carefully planned introduction to London that included practical survival information, where to find affordable housing, how to avoid dangerous areas, which employers might be sympathetic to unconventional workers, alongside more specific guidance about navigating the city's reduced but still existing underground networks. He introduced the young man to other survivors who could provide different types of assistance, helped him find legitimate employment that provided financial stability, and gradually included him in social gatherings where he could develop the kinds of relationships that would provide long-term support. What makes this story particularly significant is that Taylor received no direct benefit from helping his visitor. There was no commercial transaction, no ongoing financial relationship, and no expectation of future reciprocity. The assistance was provided purely because Taylor understood from his own experience how important community support could be for someone trying to navigate hostile social conditions, and because he retained the organizing skills and social connections that made such assistance possible. The incident also demonstrates how the knowledge and techniques developed in the Victorian underground world continued to serve important functions, even after the specific institutions that had originally employed them were gone. The methods Taylor used for screening potential community members, providing graduated introduction to sensitive social networks, and balancing individual assistance with collective security were all skills he had learned as an underground entrepreneur. But they proved equally valuable for legal community organizing and mutual aid work. Perhaps most importantly, the story reveals how the human relationships and social bonds that had been created through participation in underground networks survived the destruction of the networks themselves, continuing to provide sources of identity, belonging, and practical support for people who remained connected to those communities. The Victorian sexual underground had been more than just a collection of commercial enterprises or recreational opportunities. It had been a social world that created lasting connections between people who shared experiences and challenges that mainstream Victorian society couldn't acknowledge or address. As we come to the end of tonight's journey through the gaslit streets and hidden chambers of Victorian London, it's worth reflecting on what these long-ago voices still have to teach us about the enduring human capacity for creativity, resilience, and community in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. The men whose stories we've explored weren't heroes or villains in any simple sense. They were people responding to the conditions of their time with the resources available to them, creating something valuable and meaningful despite the risks and limitations they faced. Their world is gone now, swept away by social changes that they could hardly have imagined, and replaced by different forms of community and resistance that faced different challenges and opportunities. But the fundamental human impulses that drove their organizing, the need for connection, the desire for dignity, the determination to create alternatives when existing institutions fail. These continue to motivate people who are building communities and fighting for justice in our own time. Perhaps that's the most important lesson from our exploration, that human ingenuity and mutual support can flourish in the most unlikely circumstances, creating spaces of genuine value and meaning, even when the world seems determined to deny their possibility. The Victorian underground may have been hidden from official view, but its legacy of community building and collective care continues to illuminate possibilities for anyone who believes that people deserve better than what conventional institutions are willing to provide. Take a moment to appreciate that remarkable persistence of hope and human connection that spans across more than a century, connecting us to people whose names we'll never know, but whose courage and creativity helped make our own freedoms possible. And with that gentle thought, let's allow tonight's story to settle into the quiet corners of memory where the best histories live, not as simple lessons about the past, but as ongoing invitations to imagine what kinds of communities we might build when we combine necessity with imagination, survival with solidarity, and the determination to create something better than what we've been given.